All newly presented information in this video, including lore pieces and cut gameplay information, have been provided by a primary source who has given permission for this video to be created, but has asked to remain anonymous. As a result, any speculative portions of the video will be clearly labeled as such, so as to not confuse objective truth from subjective theory. 3 years ago today, on Halloween night, I began a series on my channel with a goofy little name I came up with a few nights before I began editing. Betafied. My goal was to take a look into the unused and cut content of a game and theorize on what it was, how it worked, and why it was removed from the final game. Cut content and game betas have always been a deeply rooted interest of mine, going as far back as the early 2010s as far as I can remember. So for that video of mine to skyrocket its way to the top of my channel, this channel I've had since 2011, it's beyond words for me to express how I feel. Ever since that first video, I've gained at least 918 new subscribers. Doing the math, I was only around 102 by the time I made it. It's honestly changed my life. The things that have come with it too as a result. The friendships I've made, the communities I've created. To say the least that I'm grateful would not be enough. I've often said about A Hat in Time that 5 years is a long time for a game to develop. A lot of things can change at that time. But in a similar manner, 3 years is a long time to develop a person. To finish high school, graduate, move on to college, vote for the first time. I want to take some time to stop, reflect, and say with some certainty that I wouldn't be where I am right now in my life if it wasn't for all of you. And because of that, you all have my eternal gratitude. Now, with all that mushy stuff out of the way, let's get back to the classic introduction. Hello everyone. My name is Wolfclock, and welcome to Betafied, the show where we take a look at the unused and cut content of a game and try to figure out what it was, how it worked, and why it was removed from the final version. On today's episode, we are finally going to take a look back on a fan-favorite character and look at him under a new light, with exclusive information we hadn't known about up until today. Today, we will be revisiting the Moonjumper. Before we get into the meat of this video, we need to start off by taking a step back into 2017 and reviewing what we knew back then. To start off, let's take a look back at what it was that I said exactly. In 2017, I had claimed that the Moonjumper was the prince of Subcon Forest. Was I correct? Absolutely. It was even confirmed by multiple developers. Let's take a look at some things that led me to that conclusion. For starters, the various paintings of the prince inside Vanessa's manor, as well as the outline of the dead prince in the basement as viewed with the Dweller mask, resemble that of the Moonjumper. Secondly, in the alpha and beta builds of the game, when playing through the manor, the Snatcher states on the 3rd floor that the Moonjumper doesn't even realize that he used to live in said manor. Thirdly, some of the ramblings inscribed on the walls on the 3rd floor in the beta by Queen Vanessa mention how the prince loved the moon. Fourthly, the attic's concept art resembled an observatory and has a giant mural of the Moonjumper on the back wall, which is still there in the final game. And finally, the Alpha Bookstore's unused singing, which went over a remix of Eric Gleiser's version of the Subcon Forest's theme done by MP2, talks about the Moonjumper and his relation with Vanessa, including remarks about his blue skin, red eyes, the moon and sky, and about Vanessa losing her mind. Next, let's recap on what I thought he was going to be used for. The Moonjumper was one of 3 creatures in Subcon fighting for control of the forest, with the other 2 being Queen Vanessa and the Snatcher. Some references to this idea of 3 people fighting for the forest can be deduced in the final version of the game when looking at the 3 towers around the forest, although Haboy claims that the 3rd destroyed tower was made to represent the kingdom of the girl who had sold the prince flowers in the final game, as opposed to the Moonjumper. The interpretation is open in either case, and he also said that it could be interpreted that way. In terms of gameplay, I stated that he was going to be a creature he could talk to in the forest for advice and hints, as his dialogue seen both in the files of the game as well as the old Chapter 2 developer commentary shows him with dialogue options concerning a prize in the shed, no idea what this might have been, probably a collectible or the hookshot, a village of the dead, obviously referencing the Subcon village, and a girl in red, referencing Mustache Girl. It's also known that the Moonjumper would have spoken in rhymes, although it's hard to say that this was really kept up on, as his dialogue aside from those 3 dialogue options don't really rhyme. Hey, they tried a little bit, but oh well. I also said that he was planned to be an antagonist of some sort, although it's hard to say how this would have been implemented. Finally, let's take a look back on what I said happened to him. Who filled the vacuum left by the Moonjumper? Well, for starters, the role of the prince was recycled to the Snatcher in the final game. That's a pretty well-known thing. I also made the argument that parts of his design may have been recycled into the Badge Seller, as both of these characters have a similarly odd and glitchy appearance to them, as well as a similar style of clothing. The Badge Seller's theme is also a progression of the Moonjumper's original theme. Now, was I correct in this Badge Seller assessment? I don't know, maybe not. Honestly, it doesn't matter too much in comparison to stuff like lore. That pretty much sums up all the points I made in my original video from 3 years ago, so let's move on to things that I didn't cover. I like to think that my Betafieds cover almost everything. I try to be thorough, scouring the internet and game files for information to make my videos informative. However, even I miss some things. Somehow, despite all the work I put into the original video, I somehow missed the entire concept of the Moonjumper being a puppeteer. I missed this so hard that I actually incorrectly stated in the following episode that the puppeteering may have been the Snatcher instead. Well, no. I was wrong. I was incredibly wrong. Not only does the original Steam Greenlight page state that the Moonjumper would be mind-controlling everyone, but we even have a scene with complete dialogue of him doing just that to a dweller at the start of the Subcon village. A lot of questions can be answered just by asking. Recently, Shane Frost, one of the original developers and the designer of the Moonjumper, the Snatcher, and most of the Subcon Force to be honest, responded to a question concerning the Moonjumper on his Tumblr, that, being perceived from a regular dimension of the Subcon Forest, he appeared flat in the sky, but when being viewed in the reverse sky realm he called his home, he'd be perceived as 3D as the rest of the place. I'm assuming this reverse sky dimension may be the upside-down part of the forest I've mentioned quite a few times previously, but it could easily be something entirely different. I can't say for sure. Now then, we've taken some short looks back at what we've already known and what we now know that I missed back then. Now, it's time to take a look at something fresh, something new. Let's learn the true story of Subcon, and what happened to the prince that made him into the Moonjumper. The following is not a retelling of the Subcon comic being written by Shane Frost, but is lore created originally for the game itself. I will link this comic in the description simply because it's excellent and worth reading. To learn what had happened to the prince, we must first take a step back and learn what had happened to Subcon to make it the way it is. More importantly, it is necessary to learn what happened to the prince's beloved, Queen Vanessa. Queen Vanessa wasn't always mad. In the final game, we can see her writings on the first few floors of the manor. It can be seen through these writings that she was protective over her prince, but she began to turn obsessed, claiming that her hair must match his, claiming that he loved bacon too much when he should be loving her, going wild and violent at the concept of him talking with another woman. However, all of this cultivated on the cut 3rd floor, a level of the manor filled with scratched out walls, paper clippings, and insane writings on said walls, claiming that if the prince loved the moon so much, he should just marry it. It's clear that Vanessa wasn't simply mad from the very beginning. It wasn't the sight of a girl selling the prince flowers that was the tipping point. She had been losing her mind for a long time. So, why is this? What happened? What was it that drove Queen Vanessa so mad? It was the same force that drove her mother mad before her, and her mother's mother before her. Queen Vanessa lost her mind through the suggestion and influence of another being. This being was stowed away inside a book, one that Vanessa discovered. It twisted and corrupted her, turning her manic and obsessive over her prince. This was just what this being wanted. It needed Vanessa to hold control over the prince, because it wanted the prince's body. It wanted a way out of the book and into Subcon. What was this being? To me, it was described as the being at the end of time. When all the stars had gone out in the universe and all light had faded, this being was alone. It was the last one left. All that was left for it was thought and dreams. However, through the infinity of nothingness, those dreams began to turn to nightmares. And by pure chance, those nightmares manifested themselves backwards through space and time, folded up neatly inside a diary. This being at the end of time had nowhere else to go, and nothing else to do except exist, alone, for eternity. With such a fate at hand, manipulating one family to try to escape this fate is hardly evil by its own nature. This being had used its influence to make Vanessa lose herself in the same way as it had done to the family before her. It wanted her to let it into her beloved, and then it would leave her as a cold, empty shell of her former self, once it had materialized into the world. There are two things known about what would follow. To begin, it required Vanessa to perform a ritual. This ritual would bring the being at the end of time back into Subcon, and give it the prince's body to inhabit. The second thing known about this is that the ritual had failed. The being was unable to fully inhabit the prince's body, or perhaps Vanessa had failed while conducting the ritual. Perhaps she had made a mistake. Perhaps the prince had been strong enough to resist. Or perhaps what was left of the queen's sanity had taken a hold for a split second. Either way, the ritual failed, and what resulted was a being lost to the horizon. This being stayed trapped in the prison of the sky. His skin was blue and eyes shot red. I can't say what percentage of him was the prince and what was the being at the end of time, but the result, either way, was the creature we now know as the Moonjumper. The Moonjumper was the result of a failed ritual conducted by Queen Vanessa in order to give the being at the end of time a body to inhabit. These days, we know nothing more than that. However, there are things that one can ask. For example, what was that boarded up room on the manor's third floor? Well, the first thing I thought it was possibly the Queen's bedroom. But we've already seen the Queen's bedroom on the second floor, haven't we? Perhaps it was the Prince's bedroom. But now we need to ask, why was it boarded up so tight? Was the Queen ashamed of what she had done? Or perhaps she hated the Prince so much for his betrayal against her that she never wanted to see his belongings again. Oh, wait. That's the story for the final game. But in the alpha, the Prince hadn't done anything to make the Queen hate him. And the door is still locked up tight in the alpha, so why is this? What I believe is that this is the room where the ritual had taken place. Perhaps it was the Prince's room, perhaps not. But in either case, whatever was in there was bad enough news, even for an insane and all-powerful Queen of Stone and Ice to want nothing to do with it. What I believe is that beyond the door lies the diary that the being had manifested in. Whether or not that being is still trapped in that book, I cannot say. but this would solve both the question of why the door was locked up and where the book was. So, now we have a noodly elephant in the room. Where does the Snatcher fit into all of this? Perhaps he was the book creature, forced to exist only as a shadow? Or maybe, as some people speculate, the Snatcher was the prince's shadow, while the Moonjumper was the prince's body and soul. Well, I have some good news, and that is that both of those are wrong. The Snatcher is, in fact, a shadow, but not a shadow left by the prince. In A Hat in Time's earlier development, shadows were fragments of time travelers. Tim, the CEO of Time, for example, had a shadow that he left behind called Tim's Friend, described as the CEO's imaginary friend. Tim's friend worked as a force of order in the face of Tim's carefree attitude. We can see this in what we already know about him. Where Tim spends his time laughing to himself and wreaking havoc from time to time, Tim's friend is known to have accompanied Hat Kid to SubCon, giving her advice. He also gave Hat Kid her umbrella, something to protect herself with, and all in all seemed much more focused than Tim himself was. These time traveler shadows are created after 3 conditions have been met. For starters, there must be a time traveler. Tim is pretty obviously one, considering his name. Next, the time traveler must be somewhere they aren't supposed to be. Again, obvious for Tim, as time had been messed up after he had a meltdown. He was scouring places he wasn't supposed to be in. Finally, the timeline that the time traveler is in must be damaged while they are there. Broken hourglasses were indicative of this, and, as we all know, SubCon is home to a massive one deep inside the forest. As I'm sure you've all noticed, there isn't much time travel in A Hat in Time. However, early on in its development, time travel and timelines were a major plot device. Mafia Town's earlier versions experimented with split timelines a bit, but in the end, these concepts were a bit hard to implement gameplay-wise. So, we know the Snatcher was a shadow left behind by a time traveler who was somewhere they weren't supposed to be, in a timeline that was damaged. So who was it that left the Snatcher behind? Was it Hat Kid? She's a time traveler. Timmy? We know that Timmy was in SubCon. Or perhaps it was a member of the royal family. Well, I have an answer for you all, though it's not quite as satisfactory as any of the previously suggested ones. As it turns out, the Snatcher was the shadow of an alien who proceeded to abandon him in SubCon. He existed completely independent of the royal family. His thieving antics were simply that, antics of his own. I have no more description of the alien who abandoned their shadow, but this is likely because, well, it doesn't matter. The Snatcher simply exists at SubCon. His creator didn't want him, so he made a reason for himself, becoming a creature that would snatch things away from people. It's as simple as that. So, to summarize, the Moonjumper was the result of a failed ritual conducted by Queen Vanessa, who had been corrupted and controlled by the being from the end of time, manifested inside of a diary. The Snatcher and Tim's friend were created by similar means to each other, but since the Snatcher was left behind, it was up to him to create his own meaning for existing. This video has been a long time coming. I've had much of this information for over 2 years by now, but I never had the genuine permission to create this video up until just a few days ago. Thank you all so much for watching, and for your continued support. It means more to me than I could ever convey through words. If you're new to the channel and you liked this video, please subscribe, rate, and share it around. It makes a huge difference. If there's a particular topic you're interested in me covering in the future, or if you just want to say hello, feel free to share it in the comments below. Thank you all again, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next episode.